What's up, guys? This is Kephas.
I've played a lot of World of Warcraft over the past year, and it's wild to think just how many different versions of the game I've jumped between in that time. Wrath Classic to Cataclysm, hopping into Classic Era with all its different versions and phases. And then there's Mists of Pandaria Remix that happened in retail, with Dragonflight rolling into the War Within. Oh, and of course, let's not forget Mists of Pandaria Classic coming soon. It's been a whirlwind of expansions, almost like I've time traveled through WoW's entire history in fast forward. And it got me thinking, out of all those expansions, which ones really stand the test of time? Which ones are legendary and which ones are just kind of meh? Well, there's only one way to find out. A tier list. That's right, today we are ranking every single WoW expansion from vanilla all the way to the War Within. We'll be reminiscing, debating, maybe even getting a little bit nostalgic or salty along the way. I'll break down what made each expansion shine or stumble, which ones I loved and which ones I really didn't. Now, I know that brevity isn't exactly my strong suit, but I'll have timestamps so you can skip straight to the expansion you really care about. And hey, this is all just my opinion. It can't hurt you, so if you disagree, let me know in the comments. Let's keep it fun, let's keep it civil, and let's rank some expansions. So we're going to start things off, of course, with the game that started it all, Vanilla WoW, or better known today as Classic WoW. And this one's kind of tough to place because part of me wants to put it in best, but after some thought, I'm going to settle on good. And before you grab your torches and pitchforks, let me try and explain. See, I love Vanilla WoW. I love the experience. Classic WoW, Vanilla, whatever you want to call it. There's just something special about it. Even today, many consider it to be one of the best MMOs out there, and plenty of players still prefer it over the modern version of the game. But I think I can understand why, because what makes vanilla so incredible is mainly the world itself. Azeroth feels massive, not just because it's big, but because you feel its size. You're not zipping around on flying mounts, teleporting everywhere, or being guided by endless quest markers. You're out there, walking, exploring, and bumping into other players who are doing the same, and it makes the world feel alive. Which brings me to the social aspect, which Classic WoW encourages in a way that modern MMOs really don't. You need people in Classic WoW, whether it's grouping up for tough quests, running dungeons, or even just trading buffs while passing by. This game naturally pushes players to work together. It's not a sandbox game, but it feels more sandboxy than retail, more like a living, breathing world you get lost in. Of course, vanilla isn't perfect. Leveling takes forever, which can be a blessing or a curse depending on your perspective. Personally, I think it adds to the experience, but yeah, it can be rough. And let's be honest, endgame isn't exactly mind-blowing. The real magic is more in the journey, not so much the destination. And then there's combat. Look, some people love it, but for me, it's a bit too slow. Some classes feel underdeveloped, and while there's depth if you really dig into things like swing timers, a lot of the time, it's just waiting for your next auto attack. Sometimes it feels like watching wet paint dry. It's not bad all the time, but it doesn't hook me in the way that other expansions do. And that said, Vanilla WoW still holds a special place in my heart. There are modern conveniences I do miss when playing it, but there's no denying its charm. It's one of my favorite versions of the game, and for that reason, it's sitting comfortably in good tier. But then we get into the main reason why I'm putting vanilla in good tier, the Burning Crusade, WoW's first expansion, and in my opinion, a straight up improvement over vanilla in almost every way. I know some people are going to disagree with me, but please hear me out. The Burning Crusade refined nearly everything from Classic WoW while keeping the core experience intact. Classes became way more fun to play almost entirely across the board. Rep Paladins weren't just buff bots anymore, and pretty much every spec felt like it had more to do. And yeah, Faction exclusive classes were no more, which I see as a win. I get that some people like the uniqueness with the factions where Alliance had Paladins and Shamans had Horde, but honestly, I think it's more important that players are able to play what they want to play, and giving both factions access to these classes was the right move. And then there's Outland. Going through the dark portal was breathtaking as you step foot into a huge alien world that feels both dangerous and exciting. I still remember the first time I walked through the dark portal. It's still one of my favorite WoW memories. Granted, I was playing on a PvP server, so within seconds, 4 dudes on flying mounts swooped down and deleted me from existence. Hilarious, and a lesson well learned. But for me, the Burning Crusade was really my vanilla WoW. I started playing right at the expansion's launch, so I never really experienced pre-TBC WoW as it originally was, and maybe that's why I have such a strong attachment to it. But even when I step outside those feelings, I just think it's better. Endgame was a massive improvement. Karazhan is one of the best raids in WoW history, atmospheric, well designed, and just fun. Dungeons felt more rewarding, gearing up was more structured, and if you weren't into raiding, there was still plenty to do, like grinding for your very expensive flying mount. Now, if TBC had a weak spot, I'd have to say it's the story. Illidan was completely mishandled. They built him up as this ultimate villain, but the execution was weak. Fortunately, Blizzard eventually fixed him in later expansion, which we'll talk about, but it didn't change how underwhelming his role was at the time. Kephas, though, was fantastic, one of the best voiced characters in the game, in my opinion. And of course, there was Zul'Aman, which was an incredible raid, and it gave us one of the coolest patch cinematics that WoW has ever had. So, while the story had some rough spots, everything else was just better. That's why I put vanilla in good tier, because the Burning Crusade deserves to be higher. It's easily one of WoW's best expansions of all time. Second only in my opinion to Wrath of the Lich King, and I know it's a cliched favorite, but honestly, I don't care. Wrath is still, to this day, my favorite iteration of World of Warcraft, and I think there are a lot of solid reasons for that. First off, the vibe, Northrend, the music, the zones, everything about Wrath just nailed that dark, adventurous, frozen wasteland aesthetic. And of course, the story. The Lich King, Arthas, is one of the greatest villains in all of video games, and Wrath delivered on his arc in a way that felt grand, tragic, and cinematic. This was a character built up from Warcraft 3, and seeing that pay off many years later in World of Warcraft was amazing. Now, some people didn't love how often he showed up throughout the expansion, thinking it made him feel like a Saturday morning cartoon villain popping up just to twirl his metaphorical mustache and then teleport away, but I actually liked seeing him frequently. It reinforced that he was a constant looming threat. This wasn't just some boss you'd hear about occasionally. He was actively working against you at every turn, shaping the world around you and proving time and time again why he was such a dominant force. And when it was finally time to face him in Icecrown Citadel, it felt like a moment years in the making. Admittedly, Wrath is also where the game really started to step away a bit from its classic roots, and while some see that as the beginning of WoW's decline, I think it struck a perfect balance. This was still very much World of Warcraft as we knew it, but with enough streamlining to make gameplay feel smoother and more engaging. And for me, in a lot of ways, class design was at its best in Wrath. Take Hunters, for example. They still had ammo, but they also had pet talent trees, which added a new layer of customization. Plus, switching between Aspect of the Viper and Aspect of the Hawk made resource management more interactive instead of just frustrating. And Paladins, they were thriving in Wrath. This is when Kephas was born, during the time of seals, blessings, and auras, and there was so much depth to the class, yet the core rotation was simple and satisfying, and really most classes felt incredible to play during this era. And I think that for me, in-game in Wrath was peak MMO fun. Sure, running dungeons over and over could get repetitive. I think any expansion will feel stale if patch cadence slows down, but when content was fresh, the dungeon system felt great. One of the things I loved most was the badge system, or I guess emblems at the time. Having that kind of bad luck protection in dungeons was fantastic. If you didn't get the drop you needed, you weren't just stuck in an endless grind. You had a clear path to acquiring gear through vendors. It gave you a sense of progression even when RNG wasn't working on your side. I leveled up and geared so many alts during Wrath because of this system, and it never felt like a waste of time. And that's why at the end of the day, Wrath of the Lich King is still my favorite expansion. Playing it again in Classic was a blast, and I already miss it. If Blizzard ends up bringing the fresh servers to Wrath of the Lich King again, you bet I'll be there. But alas, all good things must come to an end. No king rules forever, as they say, and that brings us to Cataclysm, the expansion that shattered Azeroth, and unfortunately, I think it shattered more than just the world. Personally, I'm not a fan. I know that there are some people that like it, but it's just not for me. And I'm going to start with the positives. The introduction of goblins and worgen was excellent. The expanded class and race combinations was also great. I even switched my paladin to a tauren, briefly. And then I switched back because I couldn't see anything because taurens are so big, which was kind of a dumb waste of money. So let's move on. And Vashj'ir deserves a shout out because it's one of the most visually unique zones in WoW's history. It's this massive, fully underwater region, which admittedly was kind of hard to get used to because you're always moving in 3 dimensions. It was ambitious, and it's a shame that it was so buggy and kind of unfinished. A lot of people found it tedious, but if you can handle it, it's worth experiencing at least once. And hey, I have thalassophobia. Deep oceans freak me out. The fact that I still love Vashj'ir, I think, says a lot. And that's where the compliments for Cataclysm end. Honestly, the story overall was kind of weak. Deathwing looked cool, and he certainly had this imposing presence. He was established as an incredible threat, but I suppose it is kind of hard for a force of nature to follow a villain with as much depth as Arthas had, so his story really did kind of fizzle out. I think that Firelands was kind of a high point in some ways. The raid was pretty cool, but overall, the story was kind of forgettable. I mean, they literally tried to turn Thrall into Orc Jesus. Class design was also a mess. Paladins got Inquisition, maintenance buff that you had to keep up constantly. Fun, I guess, if you like maintenance buffs. I didn't. Honestly, it felt like almost every class had some sort of maintenance buff or debuff or bleed effect or something that made every class kind of feel the same. And of course, Dungeon Finder was now here to stay, but unlike in Wrath, where dungeons were fast and easy, Cataclysm dungeons had actual mechanics, and on paper that's fine. Mechanics add a lot of depth to the encounters, but when you throw random players together who have vastly different levels of experience and patience, it's a recipe for disaster, and it was, both in original Cataclysm and in Cataclassic, where I saw so many dungeons fall apart because people either didn't know the fights or didn't have the patience to explain them. It was just exhausting. And let's not forget Cataclysm's big draw, the revamped world, which in my opinion was kind of a mixed bag. Some of the zone changes were great, others not so much. Blizzard put a lot of time and energy into these changes, and there were just a lot of people who weren't going to go back to level up new characters. There was no reason to go back and experience these old zones if you were already a maxed out character. That was one problem, but the changes themselves, again, were kind of a mixed bag. You know, WoW has always had its pop culture references, but in Cataclysm, entire zones were built around them. an NCIS parody in one place, a full-blown Rambo storyline in another. Easter eggs are fun, but when an entire quest line feels like a Family Guy cutaway gag, it starts to chip away at the world's immersion. One of the most frustrating parts for me was story retcon. Stone Talon Mountains had one of the best Garrosh story moments. He straight up executes an orc commander for dishonor. It made him feel complex. But when Blizzard went on to turn Garrosh into a full-blown villain, they retconned this entire storyline out. So you can play through an entire story that technically never happened. For me, Cataclysm isn't the worst expansion ever, but at the same time, it was an expansion that just didn't deliver. Fortunately, we move on to Mists of Pandaria, which personally I consider to be one of WoW's best expansions. I think the biggest flaw for Mists wasn't the content itself, but the patch cadence. If Mists had had the kind of update schedule we're seeing now with The War Within, I think its reputation would have been even stronger. Because here's the thing, I never really got bored because the content was bad. I got bored because it took forever to get new content. I remember playing the Timeless Isle for a couple of months, taking like a 9-month break and coming back to find, yep, still the Timeless Isle. And what started as a beloved zone became something people grew sick of simply because it overstayed its welcome. That happened a lot in Mist. And while other expansions had similar content droughts, Mist had some particularly long ones. And now with Mists of Pandaria Classic on the horizon, I think this issue won't be as pronounced. The best part of Mists, its stunning zones, the immersive atmosphere, the fantastic raids, the well-written storyline, and the class design, which was incredibly solid, will have more room to shine. The Monk class is still awesome, still one of my favorites, has been since the beginning. The Pandaren, I love them, and yeah, people thought they felt too soft for WoW, but I just don't see it that way. They're not weak, they're chill. They're a people who literally fought for their own freedom with their own bare hands against the Mogu, yet they chose a life of peace. That's not softness, that's strength with restraint. And as much as people joke about the expansion being too happy, Mists had some dark moments. The Shah were terrifying. Garrosh was a fantastic villain. The theme of war, corruption, and balance were woven beautifully in the story. Playing Mop Remix reminded me why I loved it so much, and even though I bounced off Cataclysm Classic, I'm pretty confident I'll stick with Mist Classic. But unfortunately, this roller coaster ride must continue, which means that we're moving on to Warlords of Draenor, the tragic tale of an expansion that started with so much promise only to fumble it spectacularly. That cinematic is peak. To me, it still holds the crown as the best WoW cinematic. For real, it's got as much testosterone injected into it as a day-long 300 marathon. And that was followed up with a phenomenal leveling experience. Some of the best that Blizzard has ever done. Every zone felt alive. And those cinematics at the end of quest lines were incredible. Both the Horde and the Alliance had compelling storylines, and getting to see the Warlords of old was undeniably cool. And then you have the raids. If you were the type of player who just logged into raid, Warlords was probably a great expansion for you. Like, you were feasting. High Maul was solid, but Blackrock Foundry, criminally underrated. Blackhand was a fantastic villain, made even better by his voice actor, and the encounters were creative and intense. Honestly, Blackrock Foundry deserves way more love than it gets. Dungeons were also pretty solid, and class design was still magic. I was actually making guides at this point, and I remember some of the fun experimental specs that we had. Like, we had Gladiator Stance, which turned Prot Warriors into DPS, and of course there was the Necroblight Death Knight, which was a blast to play. And then the garrisons happened. Oh boy. Blizzard's answer to player housing was, in reality, a glorified Facebook game that absolutely dominated in-game content. And look, let's not gaslight ourselves. Garrisons were intended to be WoW's take on player housing. The problem? The devs couldn't fathom putting something into the game that wasn't tied to progression. So instead of being a fun optional feature, garrisons became the entire game. Everything revolved around your garrison. The mission table let you send out followers to do your adventuring for you, to the point where you could log in for 5 minutes, collect your rewards, and log out. I remember Ian Hazakostas even saying they were fine with this because, hey, as long as people were logging in, it was a win, right? Never mind whether people were actually engaging with the game. And at first, honestly, it wasn't so bad, but once you ran out of things to do, that was it. You just sat in your garrison waiting for timers to tick down, and because this system completely suffocated in-game content, Warlords had nothing to fall back on. And then came the content drought. Blizzard cut out major parts of the story. The expansion rushed to its finale without proper resolution. We never even got the full-scale war against the Warlords that we were promised. Instead, we got a massive letdown that left the expansion feeling half-finished. And that's the main reason why Warlords of Draenor is still to this day one of WoW's biggest disappointments. It had so much promise, it could have been great, but in the end, it collapsed under its own design flaws. Like I said, this is a roller coaster ride, so we're going to move on to Legion, which I have to say goes straight to the top without hesitation. I still think Legion is the best expansion of modern World of Warcraft. It did just about everything right. It introduced world quests, which, let's be real, should have been in the game much sooner. Imagine Mists of Pandaria or Warlords of Draenor with world quests. Those expansions would have felt so much more alive, but Legion got them first, and at the time, they were a game changer. And they were sprinkled throughout some of the best zones Blizzard has ever designed. And the story was incredible. Every class had its own unique narrative woven into the broader war against the Burning Legion. Some of these story threads are still playing out today. And then, of course, they brought back Illidan and they did it right. I still get hype watching him take out Gul'dan. And Zera for that matter. Come on, you know you like I Am My Scars. Class order halls were also a huge win. Blizzard took the Warlords of Draenor garrison concept and actually made it work. Instead of isolating players in personal fortresses, they put us in shared spaces, rich with class identity and progression. And yeah, the mission table was still a thing, but at least it didn't define the experience this time. It did define the gold making experience though, but considering I got 5 years of free WoW time out of it, it's cool. I'm not sure where I personally land on artifact weapons. You know, getting them was cool and how they were part of the story. Powering them up was great, but it admittedly wasn't very alt friendly, and eventually it led to the whole artifact power grind that spiraled out of control, but at the moment, it was fun. Suramar was an incredible in-game zone that felt like real progression. Legion invasions were also a fantastic addition, making leveling engaging outside of just questing in dungeons, and it was also very rewarding if you were already a max level character. And now, if there was one downside in Legion, it had to be RNG. Titan forging made gear progression a frustrating gamble, and don't even get me started on the legendary system. The original method of acquiring legendaries, absolute nightmare. They did improve it later, but if Blizzard ever makes Legion Classic, they need to launch with the currency system intact. Overall, Legion is by far one of my most played expansions. I think it's second only to Wrath of the Lich King for me, and this was modern WoW at its peak. Top tier, no questions. Alright, so now we arrive at Battle for Azeroth, and this one might be a little controversial, but I've spent a lot of time thinking it over, and I'm putting BFA in mid-tier. To be fair, there's a lot about BFA that I absolutely hated, and I mean hated. First up, Sylvanas. Every single thing about her arc in this expansion was trash. Forcing a war just to set up her big-brained 5D chess plan that nobody wanted, awful. We all knew where this was going, and even at the time, it sucked. There was no hindsight needed. We were living the disaster in real time. Like, seriously, how many Horde villains had turned evil by this point? We get into the systems. Oh boy. Azerite power, a mess. RNG stacked, grind heavy, and just not fun. I don't think anybody liked it. Island expeditions, conceptually, were kind of cool. I think they were a stepping stone to what would eventually become Delves in the War Within, but the execution was rough to say the least. The rewards were underwhelming, the gameplay loop got stale fast, and ultimately they just flopped. But none of these things compare to the worst system WoW has ever had, like in the entire history of the game. Warfronts. These were so bad that I'd honestly take the Maul over them. Warfronts were basically an auto battler where you could stand still and still win. You ran around chopping down trees, waiting for timers, doing the same uninspired, brain-melting content over and over again, and just to make things worse, they put some of the coolest armor sets behind this trash, forcing me to grind Warfronts, making me hate them even more, and yeah, I'm still a little bitter about it. So if all that terrible stuff was in the expansion, why is BFA still mid and not at the bottom? Because despite all of that, there were some legitimately great things in this expansion. For starters, the zones, incredible. Kul Tiras and Zandalar were some of the best looking and most immersive regions ever added in WoW. I still enjoy leveling in BFA because all 6 zones were just that good. The Jaina storyline was a little bit Disney, sure, but still solid. The lore additions, the Drust, the Tide Sages, the Loa, all fantastic. This expansion did a ton of world building, adding layers to Warcraft's cultural and mythological depth. Allied races were another big win. Say what you will about the grind, but unlocking new races like Zandalari Trolls, Kul Tirans, Volpira added a lot of variety and flavor to the game. And then came the patch content, which in my opinion saved BFA from being a total disaster. Mechagon was absolutely a banger of a zone. Tons of fun stuff to unlock, cosmetics to chase, and a quirky unique setting. Nazjatar was a legitimately great progression zone with benthic gear that actually felt rewarding for alts. Horrific Visions and Inzoth's storyline, the best part of the expansion's narrative. Watching Stormwind and Orgrimmar descend into madness, fighting off old god corruption, that's the kind of stuff WoW needed more of. So when you take everything into account, yeah, the core systems of BFA were bad, the storytelling, especially the Horde versus Alliance angle, was bad, but the zones, world building, allied races, and patch content, those were actually pretty good. And that, for me, is why BFA sits comfortably in the mid tier. It had moments of brilliance, it's just buried under a mountain of frustrating design choices. Alright, let's not waste any time here. Shadowlands sucked. It's the worst World of Warcraft expansion ever, and it's not even close. No competition. This was rock bottom. Now, let's give credit where credit is due. There were a few good things, like Sire Denathrius, an awesome villain, charismatic, fun, and we were all sad to see him go. Garrosh's send-off was pretty solid, but beyond that, yeesh. The entire premise of Shadowlands was a mistake. The moment we stepped into the afterlife, Blizzard stripped death of its mystery. Suddenly, the weight of sacrifice, the gravity of finality, it all disappeared. Instead of the afterlife being some unknowable force, it became just another batch of quest hubs, complete with faction rep grinds and daily chores. There were a lot of chores. And okay, The different realms of the Shadowlands could have been cool. Bastion had the heavenly vibe. Revendreth was probably the most interesting, at least to me. Basically a purgatory where souls had a shot at redemption, and that concept alone had huge potential. There are even interpretations of post-mortem redemption in some real-world theology, but did Blizzard explore that? Not really. Instead, we got a convoluted, nonsensical Anima Drought storyline that nobody cared about. And then there was the Maw. Oh my god. I thought, hey, maybe this zone will be cool, dangerous, thrilling, a high-stakes experiencing, but nope. Instead, it was a miserable, slow, anti-fun hellscape. No mounts, no convenience, just pure frustration. And then there was Torghast, Blizzard's attempt at a roguelike dungeon. I tried it, I wanted to like it, but it was so badly implemented, an endless slog of randomness that felt less like an exciting adventure and more like a punishment. And the patch content, Korthia, Zareth Mortis, what even was that? I was already on the fence, but Korthia sealed the deal. I straight up quit WoW. First time in my life, I unsubscribed and I was done. I still remember the moment I knew Shadowlands was irredeemable. My first child was about to be born. My wife was in labor and we were in the hospital waiting for things to progress. So naturally, I'm watching the latest Sylvanas cinematics, the infamous "I will never serve" scene. And I just start laughing out loud. I literally showed my wife, look at this, look how bad this is. And she watches it and looks at me and just says, yeah, that sucks. And that was it. That was the moment. And that wasn't even the worst part. That honor goes to the final cinematic, the grand reveal that the jailer was a robot. What? You're telling me that it wasn't bad enough that the main villain of this expansion, handsome Squidward Nipples Man cosplaying as Thanos, that was just a robo plot device to set up the next expansion? Yeah, they actually made it worse. Years of lore, buildup, mystery obliterated in a single moment. It was so bad, so insultingly bad, that I genuinely believe Blizzard should retcon the entire expansion. Just give it the Stone Talon Mountains treatment. Fair trade. And you know how much I hated this expansion? To this day, I've never ran a single dungeon or raid in it. Not once. I just couldn't be bothered. Were there any positives? Yeah, a few cool transmogs, I guess, and Denathrius, and that's it. That's the list. Shadowlands was such a massive L that the game is still recovering 2 expansions later, and I wish I could erase it from WoW's history. Fortunately, bad times don't last, and so now we move on to Dragonflight. And I have to be honest, this one's kind of a mid for me. I know that might be a bit controversial because most people seem to really like Dragonflight, and you know what? I like Dragonflight too. Compared to Shadowlands, it felt like a massive step up. Like, imagine crawling through a desert for a couple years and suddenly finding an oasis. That was Dragonflight after Shadowlands. Dragon riding was huge. Sure, we've seen similar mechanics in other MMOs, but this was big for WoW. It was a game changer. Movement became fun, traveling felt engaging, and let's be real, after years of slow flying, this was a rush. I still love it to this day. And the Dragon Isles themselves, pretty solid. Azure Span especially, I adore that zone. The music there, easily some of my favorites in all of WoW. I still use it to this day. You're probably listening to it right now in this video. And then there were talent tree revamps, a much needed overhaul. It finally gave players meaningful choices in how to build their characters, and content, there was plenty. The renown system made faction progression actually feel rewarding instead of just a rep grind, and with open world activities constantly happening, Dragonflight had a lot of reasons to log in. Even dungeons got some love with follower dungeons, which were a fantastic way for solo players to experience group content without the social anxiety of pugs. You even had the opportunity to learn a new role without people screaming in your ear. Amazing. But despite all that, I just wasn't too hooked. And here's where it gets subjective. The vibe was really off for me. Dragonflight gets compared to Mists of Pandaria a lot in this regard, and I think that there is a comparison to be made because it feels like both expansions were trying to be more wholesome. But Dragonflight to me feels more soft than even Mists of Pandaria. It had this emotional tone that was overly sentimental, very much in your feels. It just didn't have the grit or intensity that even Mists of Pandaria wasn't afraid to show. It lacked a degree of stakes where the villains didn't entirely feel threatening. They felt more like Power Rangers-esque monsters of the week. And that brings me to the Dracthyr Evokers, which mechanically Evokers are pretty fun to play, if not a bit underdeveloped, kind of like how Demon Hunters were when they first came out, but there are some really fun abilities to use. Unfortunately, the Dracthyr just look goofy and I can't take them seriously. They look like lizard men more than dragons, very stiff when they run. It's a model that I feel like has only been out for one expansion and it already needs a massive upgrade, unfortunately. And it's a shame because I know that there are a lot of people that expressed interest in having at least an option for a more buff and muscular dragon, which those models do exist in the game. But Blizzard made sure that that would not be something that we would get by making those models a different race. It almost felt like a statement from Blizzard to refuse to give these players, including myself, what we want. And so we have a race that seems to resonate more deeply with the people that made it more than the majority of people who actually play it. And all this contributed to a story that felt very Disney-esque and safe, just not something that I was very interested in. While the ending cinematic was not as comically bad as Shadowlands, it still felt very cringe and very easy to poke fun at. But aside from that, I honestly think that Dragonflight had really good gameplay. It took modern WoW in a new direction, in a good direction, and I think it was the best we had seen from WoW in years. It's just, for me, unfortunately, I wasn't very invested in it. I wasn't drawn in the way I was with past expansions, and there's still stuff that I want to go back and do in Dragonflight. I just didn't feel the urge to keep playing like I did in other eras of WoW. And that brings us to this new direction for World of Warcraft with The War Within. This is the latest and current expansion in the beginning of the much hyped World Soul Saga, with Chris Metzen returning to stand at the helm and lead this game's direction, which is partially why I think so many of us are so hyped. We're about halfway through now, and having reached the Undermine patch, I have to say this expansion is a solid win for me. Would I put it in the best tier? Probably not. I think it's very much a step below the best expansions that we've had, but it's also a step up from Dragonflight in so many ways and a massive leap from where the game has been for the past few years. And I have been having a blast with it. One of the biggest surprises was the underground setting. 3 out of the 4 zones are subterranean, which initially had me worried because, let's be honest, navigating caves in WoW has not always been a great experience, but somehow they pulled it off. These zones are stunning, they all feel unique, and Hallowfall in particular, easily one of the best zones that the entire game has ever had. And it's home to the Arathi, where a lot of the game's best lore is coming from. And of course, we have to talk about delves, which again are a massive win. Delves are a fantastic addition for players who want meaningful, repeatable solo progression. With classes, they've taken what they started with Dragonflight and have expanded it even further with hero talent trees. I think this is some of the best class design work the game has ever seen. The new hero talent trees have been a fantastic addition, adding meaningful depth and variety to many specs. I've been jumping between classes so much just because of how much fun they are to play. It's something I don't think I've done since Legion. As for the story, I don't want to say that it's a return to form, but it definitely feels like it's a return of Chris Metzen because it feels like we're picking up right where he left off. The story has a lot more weight to it. There's a lot more interesting threads to follow, and overall, it's just a lot better, I think. It's a massive step up from where we've been really since he left. Especially with the Undermined patch, which has been another big surprise coming from this expansion. This patch might be one of the best mid-expansion patches I've ever seen from this game. The new drive system, which does feel a bit clunky because you don't have analog controls like what you would see in a game like Grand Theft Auto, it's still fun to drive and crash around the zone. The goblin-focused zone is way better than I expected with this jazzy music. It's a vibe, and the goblins themselves often being treated as comedic relief, and here they are with writing and storytelling that is way deeper and a lot more heavy. Very interesting seeing what goblin life is like and what they're going through. Now, I can't speak too much to the end game experience because I mostly just play delves, and I can say that delves seem to have shaken things up a lot, and there were some problems with Mythic Plus starting out in the expansion, but it seems like Blizzard has done a lot to improve things since the expansion started, and people seem to be a lot more positive about Mythic Plus now than they were before. I can certainly speak to the incredible cadence of updates that have been released for this expansion, and it's one of the reasons why this is probably the most time I've spent playing Modern WoW in many years. As much as I love playing Classic and still try to play it as much as I can, I do find myself very often being pulled in the direction of the War Within. And for me personally, that speaks volumes to how much fun I am having with World of Warcraft right now. Now, the War Within isn't finished yet, there's still more to come, but as it stands now, I really like it. And with updates bringing horrific visions back and player housing coming in the next expansion, I think there's a lot to be excited about for the World Soul Saga, and if Blizzard can maintain this momentum, then I think that World of Warcraft could have good times ahead. And there you have it, every World of Warcraft expansion ranked. Looking back, it's wild to see just how much of a roller coaster this game has been on. We've had absolute bangers, expansions that redefined the MMO genre, and, well, a few that made us question our life choices. From the highs of Wrath and Legion to the lows of Warlords and Shadowlands, it's certainly been a journey. And yeah, Shadowlands did a lot of damage, there's no sugarcoating that, but when I step back and look at the full picture, there's been more good than bad, and maybe that's why I'm still playing after all these years. It's been 2 decades, y'all. But for all its missteps, WoW has always had something worth coming back for. Do I think we deserved better at times? Absolutely. Do I hope the game keeps getting better? 100%. But at the end of the day, I've had one hell of a time with World of Warcraft, and that's, for me, what matters most. But now it's your turn. What do you think? Where do you agree? Where do you think I'm completely off the mark? Let me know about it in the comments below. With all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is Kephas. Until next time.